Hey, everybody, welcome back to You Are What You Love. I am your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are going to be talking about The Witcher, a franchise that I know best due to the hot man who plays the lead in the Netflix adaptation. But luckily, my guest, Alyssa Esteban, is an expert. She is the host and producer of Breakfast in Beauclair, a global Witcher podcast, and she's also an executive producer at Lengthy Tangent of the show Peculiar Radio. So, Alyssa, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to, as I said, talk more about things that I already spend so much time talking about because
Yeah,
it's
it's
exciting for me.
it's
Yeah.
so fun because I'm always looking for people who, already have something that they're very adamantly clear, this is the thing, and that you
Yeah.
are an expert in some ways.
Yeah. And sometimes I don't know how to feel about it. Like, I know that some of my friends tease me. They're just like, you're now the face of the Witcher fandom. And I'm like, shut the fuck up. I hate it. I have like a love-hate relationship with the concept because it makes me feel wiggly inside. But like it's obviously IP that I've grown to love, a book series that I love, and a fandom that I have adopted, I
Mm,
think, for lack of a better word.
I like that. Adopted almost implies that you are the mother hen of the whole situation, as opposed to a person within it. Do you feel like that's sort of where you've shifted with the show?
Yes. And again, like I don't know how to feel about it, but I think it's the role that I often take in a lot of different
Mm.
aspects of my life. Firstborn children, hey.
Hey.
But yeah, so it certainly feels like something that I've been very fortunate to grow and to be a part of, and to foster, really.
Yeah.
So
And did that shift of it all start with making the show, with making your podcast?
yeah,
Yeah.
I would say so. I think that when I first came into The Witcher, it was certainly as honestly as like a backseat driver to my partner at the time who was playing through the games.
Mm,
This was maybe 7 years ago or so,
okay.
around the time that The Witcher 3 had come out. And they were playing the games, and I was like, "Ooh, that looks interesting." So I didn't really want to play the games myself because I'm very much a button masher when it
Mm.
comes to video games, and I'm not useful in the least with, fingy coordination. However, I was able to, like, get into the story and get into the world, not only through the games, but also through the books. And, yeah, I can, of course, go more into, like, what that transition was, but I think when I became not just a consumer, but also an active creator, that's really where that shift happened.
Sure. Yeah, my first question is always, when was the first time you experienced it? So it sounds like it was that tangential experience of watching someone else play a game.
Yeah, and then it was really the books that
Mm,
did it because the game was fun, as it always is. I've always been drawn to role-playing games, to immersive world games. The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt, I think got like 200 Game of the Year awards in 2015, so it was very, very prominent and very prolific and really pushed the characters and the story and the IP into the spotlight, which was awesome. But it really was the books that did it for me. I think not having the context of the books when experiencing the games, because the games really are like a sequel to the series. So when you actually got to get into the books, get into the characters, the worlds, the lore, all that fun stuff, that's what really got me excited and that's what really drew me in.
Did you go right after you watched the game? Did you realize, I wanna know where the story came from and go get the books?
Yeah, it was a little bit in tandem. I was backseat watching the game, and then we had gotten the books, and then I devoured them. I absolutely
Mm,
devoured them. And the thing that I think that shift to becoming a content creator, because Breakfast in Beauclair isn't my first dive as a content creator into The Witcher,
mhm,
interestingly enough. So in 2017, Netflix actually announced that they were going to create a series based on The Witcher. This is a number of years after the games had already come out and become popular. Um, when they announced that, I kind of took a look at my childhood friend Mike Schubert, who has been on your show,
yeah.
uh, and I loved what he had done for Potterless and for the Harry Potter community, and now for the Percy Jackson fandom. But I was like, nobody's really creating anything for The Witcher, not in podcasting. Again, this was around like 2017, 2018. So I wanted to create a podcast, except I didn't have anyone to create a podcast with. So that was the fun thing. I had, at the time, I was part of a philosophy and psychology discussion group here in New York, and I asked my friends there, I was like, "Do you want to, like, read this thing and, like, create a pilot with me?" And all of them were like, "I don't read fiction." I was like,
What?
"That's
That's a
boring."
red flag.
Yeah, meh. So at the time, I didn't really have the resources to create a podcast for a number of different reasons, but the biggest thing was, hey, I don't have any guests and I'm boring by myself. So so I turned around and I was like, okay, well, what can I do by myself? And I created an Instagram account that was just pull quotes from the series, and I
Mm,
paired them with 17th to 19th century illustrations and etchings. And just basically created this artistic dive into the quotes and into the literary aspects of the world. And then, oh my god, I found friends that way.
oh,
And over the course of a year, I met, for example, these two women from Poland who create recipes based on the world. This guy from Berlin who does news about the world and about production of the Netflix series. This woman from North Carolina who makes perfumes. And suddenly I was like another creator in this greater world. And then I was able to pull them all together, being like, hey,
yeah.
I want to make a podcast now. And all of them were super gung ho about the idea. I've lost sight of the original question entirely.
Oh, no, it's, I was curious about, like, how you got from video game to book, but I feel you answered the question and then some, so I think we're good. I think
Yeah.
we're on a good
My
path.
God, I was like, I can't even figure out where to start this story because there's so many things that have happened.
Well, what I think is cool too, though, is that the one of the things that when you chose The Witcher, I always try to. Most of the time, people pick things that I'm pretty familiar with, but on the off chance that someone picks something I'm not super familiar with, I always try to spend some time kind of understanding the work and seeing where it comes from. And something about The Witcher that I thought was really surprising was how many different mediums the story spans,
Hmm.
and how those are all connected. Like there is such a large canon of things that are true about the show. I mean, about the books and about the world. Um, and it sounds like you really connected to the books and the literary aspect of these characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that really resonates with me that's different than some of the other like big fantasy worlds that are out there is that The Witcher is so uniquely character driven
Mm.
and plot driven at the expense or just at the inattention of some of the lore aspects. Like the author Andrew Sikowski hasn't gone through and like written extra books about like the history and the worlds and like the politics and like the geography and stuff like that. Everything about it is uniquely character driven. And there's something about that, like on a very personal and feral level, that really resonates with me. And I think it wasn't until I read The Witcher that I could recognize an interest in all of these other things, in all of these other pieces of media that have the same character driven story. Now I tend to gravitate toward things like The Umbrella Academy, which I loved
Mm.
for, again, ensemble cast.
Yeah.
There's a Spanish series that I love, Valeria, ensemble cast. Like just all these things that are so character driven and that it really examine the human experience and personal connections. And I think that's something that I just love in general, that when
Mhm.
I kind of see that brought to life on screen or in a book, I'm just like, "Ooh, that's my thing. Give it to me, give it to me."
I love the fact that this piece is character driven in the genre that it is, because I would
Mhm.
say sometimes fantasy is the opposite, where you have a piece that very much explores the world for an extended period of time and characters are just characters that live in this world, and then eventually you get connected to those characters,
Yeah,
and that can be part of why fantasy is overwhelming for people.
absolutely. There's a hilarious amount of things in the books that are just like, "Oh, yeah, this throwaway line about, like, this really important political figure, and it's never gonna be mentioned again, and we don't really care about it." And that happens all of the time in The Witcher.
It's kinda fun.
Yeah, I mean, conversely, you get these characters who I wouldn't even say they're tertiary characters. They're just what is less than tertiary? I don't know. But you see them throughout the course of the series, and, even though we get snippets and vignettes of these characters that have a lot to do with the overall outcome of the plot, but very little to do with kind of the day-to-day um, or immediate plot of the main characters, it's so interesting to be able to dive into that, into their continued development,
Mm,
even though they're so minor, and that's, I think, what really pushes it for me as a character-driven story, is those little vignettes, which
yeah.
to me are very unique.
Something you mentioned earlier was that you wanted to start a podcast and your friend said that they don't read fiction. Is that
No longer
is
friends with them. No,
yeah.
not necessarily.
Like, "None of those are my they're, like, listening, they're like, "Excuse me?" Like
I promise I'm still friends with some of them. That was a very sad joke.
Well, but I am curious kind of when you found this piece of work that you were so connected to that you wanted to actually create more work related
Mm,
to it. It sounds like you may have been, at the time, not around people who would have had that same feeling about this type of work.
yeah, and I think that's where, like, online communities step in,
Yeah.
especially for nerdy and geeky shit like this, right? Because I think there was something about the series and about the worlds and the characters that just kept wanting to bubble out. Like, I
Mm.
wanted to talk to people about this. I didn't have the opportunity to talk to anybody about this. Nobody cared about a Polish fantasy series, at least not in my immediate circle. And so I think part of it and part of like the online fandom and the allure of that when it's done well is that suddenly you have all of these people who like share this is the one weird thing that I'm into and you too
Mm.
are into it and we can be into it together. And it's man, so much magic happens when you can find people who at least you have, like, that commonality and that those shared values with.
Yeah.
I think beyond the interest, it's really the values of the people that I've been able to find who are also interested in The Witcher. That's where the real magic happens, I think.
Yeah, I really love that because I do think that's so true, where it is like, if you find someone who loves the thing that you love, then there's going to be other things that you have in common as well.
Yeah.
It's not just, "I really like this book, and I also really like this book, and also we don't have anything else in common." Like, it's very
Yeah.
rare that that's gonna happen.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, like, there's certain, I think, aspects or just, like, personal values that have come up,
Mhm.
either in the content of The Witcher or of, as you said, of, like, other books and other series, um, that if you value this piece of literature, this piece of media, there's a very good chance that you'll value X, Y, or Z. For example, like, the way that this is getting, like, suddenly very psychological and abstract, but, like, the way that you like to be treated, the way that you treat other people, I think those are, like, the 2 biggest ones that that, are probably most relevant to media, but it makes it all the more worthwhile, I think, when you can build those connections beyond just the base interest.
Yeah. I think, I do like the idea of finding out how people treat other people through the media that they like. There's
Mhm.
something really interesting about that because I think sometimes one of the things I was curious about for you is if there was a character specifically that you connected to the most, and I feel
Mm.
sometimes the answer to that question in different pieces of media can tell you a lot about like, almost everything you need to know about a person when they're like, "This is the guy."
Yeah. Ooh, that's an interesting question. So, there are, like, dozens of characters in The Witcher, again, to, like, various degrees of being primary, secondary, tertiary characters. I think the ones that resonate with me on a very deep level are ones that exemplify camaraderie, friendship, and loyalty.
Mm.
Without spoilers, there's a character named Milva who's very prominent toward the later half of the series, from Baptism of Fire through Lady of the Lake, if you're interested or familiar, who I love for all of those different reasons. There are characters who I find very interesting, even if I can't relate to them, ones that have a really strong response sense of, like, duty, of service, of passion. Again, firstborn, baby. All of this stuff is coming through. But yeah, it's things like that, characters like that, that exemplify friendship and loyalty, I think are the ones that I, find a lot of parity with. I'm also Hufflepuff.
That's good. I also am a firstborn child, and so listening to you, do you have how many siblings do you have?
I have 2,
Okay.
one brother who's 2.5 years younger than me, and a sister who's 5 years younger than me.
Oh,
So
my sister's 5 years younger than me too.
oh, fun.
How fun. I think it's always interesting to talk to people about where they fall in the sibling lineup and what type of character they relate to. Um, we've had this
Yeah.
conversation on this podcast a lot with, like, the CW show Supernatural, of the Dean and the Sam side of things. But it sounds like there are a number of characters that probably exemplify some of the things that you're talking about with that leadership and friendship.
Yeah, I mean, like, in The Witcher, there's gotta be, like, at least 4
Yeah.
of, like, dozens of characters. But yeah, it's, over the course of 8 books, there are so many themes that are
Mm,
covered. But one of the things that I gravitated toward, not just as a reader, but also as a creator, and this goes into, like, the naming of Breakfast in Claire, all that stuff, really was about wanting to build that sense of friendship and camaraderie and ease.
mm.
I think, and there are obviously parts of the series that cover that and parts of the series that are gory and terrifying and involve large scale, like, military campaigns, but those small moments are what I tend to enjoy, and the familiarity and the warmth of that, that I think exemplifies what it is to really be human and how that's built upon in fantasy, I think is always fun to explore.
Yeah. I would say from what I've seen of the show and what I've listened to you talk about in the books, it seems like women have a pretty strong place in this
Mm,
series, which I don't wanna say surprised, but maybe surprised, maybe surprised is the right word,
yeah.
comparatively to what we're experiencing in more mainstream, fantasy when it comes to sort of the Game of Thrones situation and
Yeah.
the House of Dragon, yeah. So I was just curious, like, about how you feel about women in this series, in this franchise.
Yeah. So there's some interesting historical context that, at least from my understanding, that can be considered when it comes to how Sikowski has built the characters and the worlds in the books. And he grew up in post-war Poland, and from what I've heard, there was a lot of influence from his experience in that time where women were a huge part of keeping things on the home front in
Mm,
Poland post-war. When the men had gone off or had been killed or were just kind of, like, coming back, um, that he was able to be in a society, in an environment where women had a lot of power and they had a lot of autonomy because they had the opportunity, to do so or needed to do so.
mm,
So, again, from my understanding, that could have colored, his interpretation of women as a person and then also in his writing. Beyond that, like, my own experience, I think there are a lot of different kinds of women that we experience in The Witcher specifically, which feels very true to life. There are women who, and these are not always, like, direct opposites, but
mhm,
they have contrast, right? There are women that are incredibly religious. There are women that are decidedly not. There are women that are magical. There are women that are not. There's an entire chapter, an entire plot that happens around, women's right to choose
mm.
within the series,
Oh,
and
wow.
there's characters on either side of that debate that would surprise you, I think, as you read that. Again, you have women who are warriors, you have women that are homekeepers, and so on and so forth, and I think that, again, one of the successes with this being a character-driven story is that we get to really see all of these different shades of femininity and womanhood.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting because I know, like you said, the series made it really popular, starting with the video
Mm.
games made it popular in a certain group of people, and then the Netflix series being, led by Henry Cavill, I think brought a whole other group of people into the show, and then those people
Yeah.
have gone and read the books.
Yeah. With the Netflix series, the showrunner is a woman, Lauren
Mm,
Hissrich, and she has done her best to I think, bring in women into the production side, to make sure women's stories are highlighted throughout the show. And I think that they certainly are. If you go back and watch it, some of the main characters' stories are more elevated or more prominent that we haven't necessarily seen in the books in that way. So it's definitely like a very specific lens in which to view the world and in which to see the production through, which I think is incredibly interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I was curious because from what I understand, they've changed some of the timelines to bring or they're I guess showing timelines at the same time that are differently shown in the books. So, I
Mhm.
know when I first watched it, I was so it took me a minute to understand what was going on because
Yeah.
I didn't realize that the character who is the she's like training to be the priestess and
Mhm.
Henry Cavill's character, their timelines are at completely different times in the
Yeah.
world. And so I know I saw a debate about that saying that, like, that the books were the only way you would understand that that's what was going on, is that those characters were living at 2 different points in time.
Yeah, it's interesting because all of the things that happen in the show or not all of them, but a lot of the things that happen in the show did happen in the books,
Mhm.
and I wouldn't say it's necessary to have read the books in order to digest the Netflix series, but I think it does help.
Mm.
The interesting thing about that is really the change in perspective. When you read the first 2 books, the short stories, they exclusively take place from Geralt of Rivia's perspective, Henry Cavill's perspective. So I think it's almost less about the timelines because those are things that are happening at the same time. But I think it's more about the reintroduced perspectives and the
Mm.
fact that we are with Yennefer and we are with Ciri um, throughout periods of their life in which they're not with Geralt. So, but yes, all of these things are more or less happening at different points in time. It's just a matter of like I think extrapolating it from the it's not even a particularly linear timeline in the books, but, when you add on those additional perspectives, I think it gets a little hairy to watch.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, it's I will say it's very beautiful. The show is stunningly done. Like, every part of it feels very large, and I wondered how it compares for you to the books. Like, as I know, like, sometimes when you have a book so core to you and then they're like, "We're making a movie," you're like, "Oh, maybe don't do that." Like, you're not gonna be able to do it the right way. Do you feel like it was successful for you?
so I think the interesting thing about that question and about the worlds of The Witcher is that it's inherently goofy,
Mm.
like, in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And I think part of that is the fact that it's very, there's a lot of humor in the
Mhm.
story and in the writing. And it's interesting to see the ways in which that translates into a show, especially one that I think comes after the grandeur of Game of Thrones, and that kind of fits into the at least for a lot of people, like, fits into their mental model of, like, Lord of the Rings, Game of
Mm.
Thrones, so on and so forth. So it's an interesting question to come back to because there are parts of production that are grandiose. There are parts of production that are a little bit goofy,
Mhm.
and it's kind of it's like an interesting contrast, and I'd love to see them, I think, push more into that in certain places,
Yeah.
because I think there are parts of it that I would love to see just, like, blown out and super extra costuming going really hard, monster and SFX going really hard, um, and then finding moments of I think, delight
Mm.
that you could really push in the story and the production. So yeah, it's, I don't know, I think that there's more to explore if we had the opportunity. Yeah.
That's fair. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Goofy as, like, a core concept
It's so
because
funny.
well, I remember the first thing that I really started to see fandom-wise from people when the TV show came out was, like, remixes of the "Toss a Coin to Your Witcher"
Mm,
song,
yeah,
and they just got progressively more
unhinged.
ridiculous. Yeah. I was like, "Who is this little like, there's a very large, like, blonde-haired man and a very
Mhm.
small man with a fiddle, like, what's going on here?" And it's interesting because I think that goofiness is what, pulled me in to finally go, "Okay, well, I should watch it." And then the show is obviously not nonstop laughs, but it is interesting that the fandom that I assume had either no knowledge of it prior to the show or, a spanning knowledge of it like yourself, both seem to latch on to the one big goofy thing, and that's what continued to progress through the internet.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting when you actually read through the books and the story is that one of the things I say so often on my show is that, "Oh my god, the main character is so dumb." And, to an extent, he, like, kind of is at times, but there's, I think, this seriousness that even though it's like, a down and out medieval-ish setting, there's a lot of, I think, levity that happens in it. And, yeah, and again, in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect or with characters who you wouldn't necessarily expect to be funny, or there's situational comedy, which in and of itself, inherently funny. So, as I said, I'd love to see that pushed more, and I guess considering the canon
Mhm.
of fantasy, um, I do really think that sets The Witcher apart from some of the more, like, stoic kinds of fantasy and, like, epic fantasy that you have. Like, the books are self-referential, the show is self-referential, and sometimes it's like a swing and a miss, but
Yeah.
oftentimes, it's for humor or for just that analytical lens on our worlds and our society.
Did you have a big connection to fantasy prior to The Witcher, or was The Witcher your first jump in?
Definitely not. I I love fantasy, I always have. Started with the Scholastic Book Fair, really,
Oh,
when
wow.
I was but a young tot.
What a
Um,
throwback.
I know. I think my first foray into fantasy was, The Two Princesses of Bamar by Gail Carlson Levine, and, also Time Cat by Lloyd Alexander, I believe. I think the thing that really drew me into fantasy, as a child was a certain level of, like, escapism and, like, characters that are bigger than they are, monsters and challenges that are bigger that are larger than life. And, The Two Princesses of Bamar really stuck with me because it was about, like, 2 sisters, one of whom was, like, older, and she was destined to be a warrior, that kind of bold character, and there was a younger sister, Addie, who was always quiet and, like, needle pointing in the corner, and then
Oh.
s all of a sudden, the older one gets sick, and it's the younger one who has to take up the mantle
Mm.
and, become the champion of the realm. So, the idea that you can kind of overcome your challenges no matter what their size, or, for example, in the case of her older sister, that there are even larger things out there that are beyond our scope of perception, always interested me. Yeah, I just loved that the story of overcoming those perceived challenges. It kind of formed a lot of my early concepts of not just fantasy, but also of, like, again, loyalty, marriage, duty, all of these things, that I think have just shaped me as a person, as an adult, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the cool thing about fantasy is part of what you're talking about is, like, these big, big ideas, but also almost antiquated is not the right word, but classic values, I
Mhm.
almost wanna say, like, you don't see a lot of modern, um like, HBO's Girls isn't talking about loyalty in the same way,
Yeah.
and I think there's something very warm-hearted about those, like, themes being the core theme of what you're reading.
Mhm.
And especially at such a young age, you're talking about the Scholastic Book Fair, and I have such a vivid memory of the Scholastic Book Fair because I was obsessed with it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I was like, I honestly, every time someone says the words Scholastic Book Fair, I go, "Oh my god," like, you can, like, like, it feels I feel like I'm getting the little slip and asking for cash for my checkout for later. And they used to roll in those carts. Ugh, what a good time.
Yeah.
Um, were you a big book kid? Did you read a lot as a kid?
Oh, yeah, I have really
Yeah.
shit eyesight, and I attribute that to, like, reading a lot as a child because I would sneak books. I loved reading, would always get stuff from the library, and I plugged in a nightlight at the head of my bed so I
Yep.
could read, like, without my parents knowing, because God forbid I read. But I would be reading these books, like, late at night by, like, the light of a nightlight, which wasn't that bright. So now I have -4.5, -5 eyeballs, which isn't great.
I feel like you just solved why my eyesight is so bad. I was like, I've always had
Pseudoscience.
yeah, you're like, "I got it." No, I've all of my family wears glasses, but mine have always been the worst, and I've always been like, "This is ridiculous." Like, I don't we all eat we've been eating the same thing, we have all the same environments, why you're right, it's all of the reading by
Eye
late
strain.
night. Yeah. Oh, wow, I feel like I learned something about myself today. Um, so apart from your battle wounds of terrible eyesight, I
Mhm.
love this image of you just kind of reading. Um, it's interesting. I think a lot of kids have this urge to hide it to some degree, like you're saying, like under the covers with a nightlight. When I think most parents would be thrilled that that's you're like, "Can I stay up to read a book, please?"
Yeah.
As opposed to a number of other issues a child could pose to parents. Were you objectively like a good kid? Did you get into a lot of trouble?
I didn't get into a lot of trouble. I was also kept very preoccupied, I think. I had so many hobbies, and again, this is why I am the way that I am today, is as a kid, I was, like, apparently reading a lot. Dance, cheerleading, ice skating, swimming, this, that, the other thing, musicals eventually, and lacrosse for a hot second.
Ooh.
Um, but yeah, New Jersey, baby. And I've always had all of these hobbies, which has, translated to, like, the way that I am now,
Mhm.
and why I have so many weirdo skills, that experiences that I just, like, pull upon to support podcasting.
Yeah.
Really, now that's what that is. And, it's yeah, I don't even know, like, I'm just like, "Oh, no, this is why I am the way that I am now."
I'm curious, were all of those hobbies things that you said you wanted to do, or were some of them or all of them things that your parents wanted you to try or
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of popped into dance for something to do, but I stayed there from 4 to 18. Cheerleading was something that I wanted to do that I started when I think I was about 10. The swimming and the ice skating were more about, like, hey, life skills. And I didn't do them for very long, but at least I can, like, skate forwards and backwards and I won't drown, probably. So
fingers crossed?
it's a lot of it's like things like that.
Yeah.
Um, Not going to the Olympics anytime soon, at the ripe age of 30, but I can at least, like, probably not kill myself in those 2 environments. And yeah, but I think as I got older, that translated to, as I said, like, an interest in musicals.
Mhm.
The ability to dance and act and perform. Um And what else? Interest in just, like, visual arts, which I had always had as well, which eventually served me well as a full-time product designer designing apps and websites, but also, oh, no, I've learned all of these things throughout my life and in college that I know how to video edit, I know how to do visual design and branding, and, like, I know how to perform vaguely because I did musicals as a kid. And, uh, and yeah, and then suddenly, poof,
Yeah.
podcast.
Someone give you a microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love this idea of, like, the number of things that go into making up a person, and all
Mm,
of the things that you listed are interests or skills,
yeah.
but skills driven by interest. And I'm curious, kind of a lot of the things that you mentioned are also physical, so, like, dance and ice skating and swimming and musicals to some degree are a sport. Um, uh a lot of I know I used to have as a kid when I would read these, like, big fantasy or, like, superhero things or whatever, I was like, "Oh, I have to be ready at any moment for someone to tell me that I was destined to carry a sword and and fight my way
Yeah.
through." Did you have any of that as a kid?
Oh my god. Like, how deep into my, like, psyche do you wanna go? This is, like, relevant now. So let me let me embarrass myself for
Always, yeah.
just always yeah. Safe space and all that. Recently reread Percy Jackson,
Okay.
because I was a guest on Mike Shearer's podcast, and there's a bunch of training sequences that also happen in The Witcher, where they're training a young girl to kind of be this battle-ready individual, and I have always done physical activity, as you said. I love, working out. I started powerlifting a number of years ago, stopped that, but still work out quite regularly,
Mhm.
and I am better with strength than I am with cardio,
Okay.
which comes to the following point that sometimes, especially when I'm in the middle of reading something along these lines, about, like, super awesome teenagers who have superpowers. I'm just like, "Why? Why am I like this? If a 17-year-old in a fake book can do this, why can't I?" And it's like, "Oh, yeah, it's because you're 30 and you're breaking."
It's it is so real that, like, your body starts deteriorating way earlier than you expect it to.
It's so sad.
It's so depressing. Um, and I have the same urge where you're like, "Why can I not I should be ready." Like, if someone taps you on the shoulder tomorrow, like they're going to do, and just is like, "You have a grand destiny, it's time to go." I did get, like, a boxing setup during
Ooh,
quarantine.
okay.
Yeah, and it's, great for those feelings.
Yeah.
And then I was gifted, these, like they're technically collector's items, but you're supposed to use them, which feels weird, but they're boxing gloves that look like the Iron Man gauntlets.
Oh my god, so cute. I'm into it.
So but yeah, I always think it's interesting when you get into types of media that give you this idea that, like, you could there is some sort of peak human performance level attached to these
Yeah.
characters, and you start to want that same thing for yourself.
Mm. Well, I think that comes back to the idea of fantasy, science fiction,
Mm,
just stories in general, being an exaggeration, but still like a very pointed examination of, again, like the human condition or what it means to be human.
yeah.
And I think that that physical athleticism is certainly part of that, depending on who you are, what you're reading. But yeah, I hate that in my head, I can hear one of the characters from The Witcher being like, "You're panting like a dying mammoth." And I'm like, I know. I'm not meant for cardio.
Oh, and now I feel like you should there's a physical fitness app of just various Witcher characters yelling at you in canon quotes to keep you motivated.
I think there's like at least six, so you can probably like make part of an app with that. I can design it. I'm a designer, right?
You're ready, yeah. You go, billion-dollar idea. I am curious kind of about your experience moving from just being someone who enjoys this by yourself to
Mm.
finding a community online to experience the books with together. I loved the idea that you found people to then make content with by this it sounds like almost desperate urge to have someone want to talk to you about it with this
Yeah.
Instagram account. Um, and I'm curious about that. Like, how did you it sounds like you're spending time sitting down, pulling quotes, making graphics, posting them to Instagram, reaching the people who also care about it. Like, that's a lot of effort to put into even before you get to a podcast.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird. I think it's a weird thing to decide to do, but I think it is, I think, born of that desire to just put out those feelers and say, like, "I like this thing. Who likes this thing?" And then you can but the power of the internet and the power of communities is that people will find you and people will seek you out. So if they too are so desperately interested in this content and they too have no one to talk about it, suddenly they're online looking up podcasts and like looking up things on Instagram, just like hashtag Witcher, what's there?
Mm,
And when it came to building that community, the translation from, static page into podcast was fortunate and just kind of like lightning, really. Because as I said, I had had that period where I was involved in these philosophy and psychology groups. I was moderating discussions every week in person. And then when I eventually found the like people around the world who were interested in this thing, again, mostly through Instagram. Thanks, algorithm. It, like, allowed me to tap people who weren't necessarily creators, but who still had a story to tell and
Yeah.
who still had an experience with the series. The fascinating thing about The Witcher is that aside from being, the examination of human, it really is a pan-European story, and, like, it
Okay.
it pulls a lot of inspiration from different mythologies, different stories and fairy tales, especially early on from around Europe, and it makes a lot of references. Tsukofsky was a traveling salesman for a hot second throughout Europe, and a lot of these stories have those influences. So when you start talking to different people from different cultures about what they're drawing from this series, it becomes a very interesting dialogue, an examination of
Mm.
this story because everybody has something different that they're taking away from it. Everyone has a different point of reference and finds different references throughout the series. So it was a bit serendipitous in that, like, I found all these people and suddenly they were from all over the place. And I just kind of like said on the first episode, it's a global Witcher podcast. And I kind of like manifested that for myself and like, holy shit, now it is. I always kind of maintain that I'm not like the best host. I'm not like the best person to like make a podcast. But I have all these weirdo skills that I've picked up throughout my life. And I'm at least a right person to do it in this way. It's definitely a community driven take on discussion and on podcasting. And the community that's been built around it, it's people who have self selected themselves because they're interested in a deep discussion of this series and want something more out of it. So it's made for like a really awesome community since then.
Yeah, I think there's something really it's interesting that you say Instagram because I do think you may be the first person I've ever talked to who has found fandom on Instagram. For me, I always think of Instagram as this, like it is, like, the one social media I try to stay off of,
Mm,
because it is so I'm trying to find the right word for it. I feel like Instagram has always been this place, in my experience, where it invites you to compare yourself to others.
mm,
It invites you to select the best frame of yourself. It invites you to download number of apps where you can change how you look before you
sure.
post your photos and all of that. And it almost has this just energy of every once in a while I'll log back on to like post like, oh, listen to my podcast. But it's kind of
Yeah.
the extent of my experience with Instagram these days. And I'm curious because it seems like you found the same type of community people talk about finding on Tumblr or
Yeah.
AO3 or that kind of thing, and you managed to find it on Instagram, so how did you do that?
Yeah. I mean, I think so the interesting thing about it is that again, like I think Instagram started serving me other Witcher creators, but that crucially weren't podcasters because there really
Mm,
were none at the time. And because of that, again, it became about like highlighting stories and highlighting people who were in the community but not necessarily doing what I did. So it became
okay.
an opportunity to storytell and to profile all these different people. Um, so it was never about comparisons or competing because we're all inherently doing different things. We just happen to have like a common base interest. Like I'm
Mm.
not going out and making fucking perfume because I don't have that somehow has not been a skill that I've picked up over the last 30 years. Um, and I'm sure as hell not gonna be making recipes in my play kitchen here in New York. So I've been able to, like, really find people who are really doing the best in their unique industries. We just happen to have, like, this thing in common. So, yeah, that I think that was a lot of it, was that I can admire these people and their work, and they're so freaking cool. Um,
Yeah.
and it's just I'm adding to that pot just in a very specific way.
I loved the idea that you said it's a global Witcher podcast,
Mm,
and I love this the fact that it sounds like the fandom of this franchise in particular spans beyond what you're used to when it comes to it's an American-centric piece of media. Americans are very interested in it, and then it gets sort of distributed outside of America,
yeah.
and people enjoy it. That's sort of our typical mainstream media experience, whereas this is imported, I would say.
Mm.
It's Polish, as you mentioned. Um, have you found that that makes maybe fandom a little bit more inclusive or a little bit more, wide spanning?
Yeah, it unfortunately, it is an inherently loaded question because I think I have happened to attract people who are, as I said, like, interested in discussion. They self-select the fact that they're a part of the community around this podcast.
Mm,
I think with any as with any fandom, there are aspects of it that have just a ton of toxicity, because they gravitate toward things that aren't necessarily it's just like, "Ah, did you actually read the content of what we were talking about? I don't know."
mm.
But there's certainly, like, for example, the fact that there is a woman at the forefront of the show. I think even before there were any production decisions made that she had made throughout the series, the fact that it was a woman at the start was a point
Mm,
of contention. The fact that she made the decision to focus on certain storylines that were women-centric was, for some people, a point of contention. The fact that there are people of color in this,
yeah.
show that's born of Poland, also for certain aspects of the fandom, point of contention. And so, I've like I said, I've managed to find people who that's not the thing that they wanna
Mm,
discuss. They want to talk about, like, the underlying values. They wanna talk about, things aspects of production that they're interested in, music, costuming, this story itself, like how to translate something from script to screen, from book to script to screen, and I like that part. That's the
yeah.
part that I feel very fortunate to have.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the things that you listed are unfortunately, it seems like the things that everyone complains about when it comes to fantasy. Like,
Yeah,
those tend to be, "Oh, there's a woman in charge. It's not gonna work," or, "Oh, there's women in it. That's not gonna work. There's people
yeah.
of color in this fake universe that doesn't exist."
I know it
Born of
doesn't even take place on this planet, like, canonically, and I can't say that to anybody, but, like, you guys can know. This is like a book 7 spoiler, literally not on this fucking planet.
It's like, "Oh, but it is Polish." So, um,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's anyway.
No, I think, I always I'm interested in it because there's
Mm,
a level of, like, it's happened with the Lord of the Rings show that's just come out.
yeah,
It's happened with this. It's happened with Game of Thrones, like, or not as much with Game of
House
Thrones,
of the
just
Dragon.
yes, House of the Dragon. There seems to be this idea that a completely made up world in which we fight completely made up character like, completely made up dragons and beasts and monsters in ridiculous costumes with medieval weapons.
Yeah,
Like, somehow all of that adds up to it's a European, um, white only narrative, like, there should only be white people in this, and I'm so confused by it. I really don't know where it comes from.
yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think to add color to this conversation, I'm an Asian woman behind the microphone, so
Yes.
that's
Yes, and
that's
you
that's some
can
context for that,
yeah.
and, I think it's interesting in what they're doing with the casting for The Witcher, in that they really are attempting to cast the best actors for the role that personify the characters, and this is
Mhm,
done with, Sophie Holland, her casting agency, um, but and it's interesting because so far there have been characters of color, um,
mhm.
none of whom have been Asian actors, East Asian actors.
Interesting.
There
Mhm,
are South Asian actors in the show, a number of them, but nobody who is specifically East Asian. I'm Filipino myself.
mm,
And however, for their upcoming series, they have a limited series coming out on Christmas 2022 called Blood Origin. And Michelle Yeoh, Emmy nominated, Oscar winning, whatever, Michelle Yeoh is one of the leads in that. In the Netflix universe, I think not counting the anime, she's the first live action Asian actor with like a line after 2 seasons. Um,
wow.
and we're gonna, in the next season, season 3, I believe, see 1 or 2 characters of East Asian descent. So I am cautiously optimistic that we will hopefully see all of this, done well. I
Yeah.
think there are a few things that I've heard that I'm just like, "Ooh, I hope this is done justice, please."
Yeah, fingers crossed. I would say, I'm of mixed race descent and, I've got a lot going on, but I would say something I'm always curious about is I have these conversations with people, in general, where they seem to think that, from, like, the marketing standpoint, that people of the majority aren't willing to watch things that feature people of the minority because they don't relate to them. And I think it's interesting because I feel like the reverse is true for minority
Mm,
viewers where regardless of what you're talking about, whether it's women, whether it's race, whether it's sexuality or gender identity, whether it's a disability standpoint,
yeah,
or anything like that, all of those people have had to find ways to relate to characters that either don't look like them, don't experience love in the same way that they do,
mhm,
don't they haven't had to go through life with the same sort of issues, but we've found ways to relate to those characters
yeah,
regardless. And I'm always interested why people think that the reverse wouldn't be true if you put those same minority characters on and gave them, because I think it comes down to, especially in genre fiction, the same idea that you're talking about, its underlying values,
mhm,
which seem to be what pulls you into it. So you can watch a show that stars Henry Cavill and relate to him, or you can read a book that is of Polish descent about people who don't exist in a world that doesn't exist. I must continue to say,
yeah,
and find things that are important. Um, because it comes down to it's a human experience,
yeah.
despite the fact that they're technically not human. Um, but yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts. I sort of rambled there, but
Yeah, I think it's a number of different things. I think beyond what happens at, like, an entry level and, like, a few levels up, I would be under the assumption that a lot of executives still in either in decision-making roles, um, are probably not representative of the
yeah.
diversity that we would see in the world. Um, I think that that has something to do with it. I think it can be that there is certainly a majority of people who struggle with the idea of watching minority stories, whether those be, as you said, with race, religion, sexuality, disability, so on and so forth. Um, but I think a lot of that is has to do with gatekeeping as well in the industry.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I think until those shifts of power can happen, we're going to see decisions made that don't necessarily reflect the stories that we're interested in seeing. Which is why like grassroots independent works are so important until we can get like larger, larger viewership for them
Mm,
and larger presence. Things like and beyond Crazy Rich Asians, Black Panther,
mm.
so on and so forth. Um, so fingers crossed, and in the meantime, we could do the work that we can do at the level that we're at,
Yeah.
until things continue to grow within these industries.
Yeah, I think Crazy Rich Asians is an interesting example that you bring up because I was reading an article recently. They were talking about the Bros box office, like
Mm,
kind of the underperformance there.
yeah.
Um, and one of the points that they talked about was that a lot of diverse media is forced to market themselves as the first of or this groundbreaking thing.
Ugh, yeah.
And they used Crazy Rich Asians as an example of that. But they pointed out that one of the reasons why it was so successful is that it already had a massive audience from the books. It also had, it was also still able to sell or they were still allowed to sell a normal kind of romantic comedy fantasy,
Mm,
with it, even though they also had to tag on, "And it's the first of
yeah,
its kind."
yeah.
Um, and they used a tested director. John M. Chu's name is quite recognizable
Mm,
and everything like that. So, I'm it's always interesting to me how it feels like sometimes even when we do get a large blockbuster piece of media that is not only centered on a diverse cast, but it also has diverse people behind the camera.
Mhm.
Like with Crazy Rich Asians, it has to already have a built-in audience, and it also gets forced to market the fact that, look, we promise
Yeah.
it's a diverse story. Um, and I don't know if that ever feels like for you it cheapens things or it feels frustrating that that's where that marketing comes from.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of that is that question of, like, when have we, like, quote, unquote, like, "achieved it"? Like, is it when nobody notices anymore, or when we have these, like, big cast productions like the ones I mentioned, that are completely centered on showcasing diverse stories? Like,
Yeah.
is it when we notice or when we stop noticing? And, like, I don't know the answer to that. Like, I would love to see all of these stories highlighted, and I think I don't even know what the next step would be, though. Like, I think Crazy
Yeah.
Rich Asians, Black Panther, Coda,
Yeah.
also award-winning film, that centered on a lot of deaf actors, um, and elevated their story and elevated their skill and their talent, which was amazing to see. But, like, it's that question of, like, should that be amazing?
Yeah.
It's always that weird question.
Yeah, I think for me, I think part of it is when like, Coda is a good example actually, because there's only one really well-known actress in that movie,
Mm.
and I think she's really well known from, unfortunately, having played the deaf character in a number of TV shows that did very well.
Yeah,
Like, she was in West Wing, she was in Switched at Birth, um, and I think when you look at the reverse, like a Crazy Rich Asians or a Black Panther, um I remember with Black Panther in particular, because 'cause I'm a big Marvel person, I remember being like, "Okay, I'm very excited this movie is happening, 100%." That movie, I love it. I've cried multiple times watching the trailer for Black Panther 2. I'm very
mhm,
emotional about it, and all of that. So there's nothing to be said that it wasn't a great movie and that I'm not happy with it. But it is one of the first Marvel movies where they were like, "We have to put every movie star ever." Like,
yeah,
every Black movie star is in that movie
yeah,
except for Denzel Washington. Um, and it feels almost like same thing with Crazy Rich Asians, except for maybe Henry Golding, I guess, was sort of untested, but
yeah,
you've got sort of this A-lister list of people that, of course, when you see them in the trailer, you're excited. But I think for me, it's when you can see that people in large studios, like big studios,
yeah,
are willing to invest in diverse content that also has untested talent
absolutely.
at the forefront.
And it makes me think of things like Our Flag Means Death and Heartstopper. Ooh, I
Yeah.
had, like, a month as a little bad girl, watching all of that. I think that all, like, came out in the spring, and I just watched them
Yeah.
back to back, and I was like, "I feel seen." Um, and it's but they were not everybody, but majority unknown actors, and then, like, Olivia
Yeah.
Colman. But we weren't watching for Olivia Colman. I was watching to see these unknown actors just, like, fall in love. And and I think, like, again, when it comes to, again, these 2 ensemble shows that I gravitate toward because they're ensemble character-driven pieces, and, I I found so much joy in watching them and in seeing a combination of stories that I wasn't necessarily familiar with and a number of different experiences that I haven't necessarily had. But it opened my perspective, of course, even though I came to it as a woman of color that's not necessarily straight. And, it's been made all the more interesting, and I'm glad that I was able to see myself in these pieces of media, even if I had to, like, jimmy myself in a little bit, but
Yeah.
but I loved
Yeah.
it, I loved it.
Yeah, I think both of those shows are great examples because you've got, yeah, I think with Heartstopper, that's the best one where you're like, "I don't know who any of these people are, but Olivia Colman is here, and I also want her to be my mom." So, um, this works for me. Yeah, and it's also cool to see, especially with Heartstopper, you see, oh, I'm forgetting that actress's name. She plays the best friend who has to go to the girls' school
Yes.
and leaves them. Yes, there we go. That actress has now been cast in Doctor Who. Like, you get to see these
Her
big
first and
something
second
that
role.
I
Girl,
know,
I
and
can't.
I know, and it's wild because I think it's awesome to see an example where you say, "Look, if you do use untested talent in diverse storytelling, not only will it work, but you can make new talent.
Yeah,
You can push that out." It was such a hit that you're talking about someone going from a little Netflix series that perhaps wasn't expected, to do it's not a huge budget, there's not a massive investment in that, and it's a nice little rom-com that people
yeah,
enjoy. Uh, and then it goes sh the next thing she gets to do is the biggest franchise in British history.
yeah. It's literally 4 hours and has little to no CGI, like,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it has brought up these actors who were relatively unknown, or completely unknown, or not actors
completely,
at
yeah.
all.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, it's a we went on a nice little tangent there, but I think, and also the reverse is true with Our Flag Means Death, which is that those guys have been working their ass off for so long,
Mm,
and finally,
hit
Taika's
mainstream.
kind of broken through and it was able to help become mainstream,
Yeah.
um and that also is another, a Marvel situation where Taika was, um when he was announced as taking over the Thor movies, people were outraged,
Mhm.
and I was like, Just you wait, we're about to have a great time."
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, people were, that was not a good day in the to be a Marvel fan, to watch people react to Taika taking over for the original writers of the Thor franchise, but,
Mm.
um, what can you do? But yeah, it's great to see. I guess the same thing I'm complaining about. I guess, part of the reason I'm complaining about it is I'm like, "Look, it's been tested and proven,
Right.
so just do it." Yeah, so,
Absolutely.
um,
Absolutely.
yeah. From our nice spiraling conversation about diversity, I am curious I am curious for you when it comes to The Witcher and, like, the community that you've built
Mm.
around it.
Yeah.
Did you find that, I guess, the books perhaps don't have, um, clear the same characters who are being cast as diverse in the TV show perhaps aren't necessarily, written as, diverse in the books, or would you say they
Yeah,
are?
not necessarily. Like, there are, like, some physical descriptions that we get here and there, but they're not necessarily, like, expansive all of the time. I think there are certain
Yeah,
characters that, of course, he goes into detail about who they are, what they look like, but not everything. And
yeah.
so there are certain things that they've kept. For example, one of the women has chestnut-colored hair that in the
Okay.
games was vibrantly red, violently red, in fact. And so when it came to the Netflix series, they cast a woman of mixed descent, and, she had chestnut-colored hair in the show, and then people were outraged that it wasn't fire truck red. So then in season 2, it's slightly more fire truck red, but it's kind of like, "Oh, why do those things matter?" Um, but yeah, it's I think there is an opportunity, it's to for it to be open to interpretation. I don't see why
Sure.
that would be an issue because it ultimately doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I think the sentence ends
Doesn't
there.
take place on Earth, yeah. I guess what I was curious about
Yeah.
is it sounds like you've not only been able to see yourself in this piece before the TV show,
Mhm.
um, and then relate to it so much that you created work and started to find people online to talk about it with, then created a whole podcast,
Yeah.
which has a large community around it now as well.
Mhm.
How does it feel to kind of, it sounds like, pull the positive people out of the fandom and put them into one place?
It's bizarre. Like, it's so much fun, and I have to pinch myself just being like, how did I do this? Why did I do this?" But I'm so grateful to be here now because it's like, these people are actually my friends. Like, these listeners,
Mm.
after a number of years, like, they've become my actual everyday talk online on Discord for hours friends, and I vacation with them. I don't know
Oh,
any
I
other
love
podcaster who goes on week-long vacations with their listeners. That sounds genuinely insane. Um, and but at the same time, it's like, I think it comes back to this idea of passing interest and underlying values. We rarely talk about The Witcher at this point in that Discord server because we talk about tons of other shows we're watching. We talk about art, we talk about there's an entire channel specifically around, like, plants. I can't own a plant to
Mm.
save my life. Um, but they talk about, like, their gardens, they talk about cooking, they talk about what's going on in their lives and seek out advice from this community. We have a channel that's named after an obstacle course in The Witcher that's called The
Oh, okay.
Pendulum, and that's where people kind of go to ask for advice, air their grievances, ask for help with looking for jobs, that sort of thing, and it just blows my mind that
Yeah.
people have come to this community. It's like a Trojan horse of like, "Ah, you like The Witcher? Have an entire lifestyle that has nothing to do with it, and a community that has nothing to do with it. You wanna talk about beans? Girl, we got you. We'll talk about beans." And I'm just like, "Why is this a thing?" But I'm so, so grateful for it. And yeah, like I said, it it just feels like that it feels like that, old adage of just like, "Yeah, a butterfly flaps its wings over the ocean, and suddenly there's a tsunami in Japan." And that's what it feels like. It's like, holy shit, I, like, s had a passing interest in The Witcher, and then
Mhm.
why am I suddenly, like, flying to Ireland? Why am I making an audio fiction series? Because I liked this one thing 7 years ago, and then now my entire
Wow.
life is different. Bizarre.
That's amazing. So, you have to tell me more about these podcast vacations you're taking.
Yes.
So, how did that come to be? Is that like a retreat for Witcher podcast listener? What's going on?
Oh my god, it's like we're friends. Like, that's the oh
Oh,
my
you just
god,
they're
holy
just
crap, we're
pals.
friends
Oh, I
taking a
see.
vacation,
Okay.
yeah. But it's the kind of thing where, like, because we spend so much time together and again, the unique thing about Breakfast in Beauclair is that it's not me and a standard co-host, it's me and typically 2 people from completely different countries having a
Mm,
conversation about this thing. So, even the online presence has always been global. So, it kind of turned into this thing where, like, people wanna meet up. And, so it really is more of like a meetup vacation kind of thing. So the very first one we did was earlier this year in Northern Ireland in Belfast, and it was a bit of a convoluted story in which we were planning to go to Edinburgh, and then
mhm,
Omicron hit, and then we were like, "Oh, we
mm,
need to cancel that." So we did. But eventually, there was this guy from Boston who was going to go to Belfast in order to go see the Game of Thrones exhibition that's outside of the city. And then he started being like, "Oh, you should come with me. You should come with me. You should come with me." And all of a sudden, people were making plans to go meet this guy in Belfast. And I'm like, "Well, if all of you are meeting up, I want to freaking meet up because
I
it's
wanna
my
go.
podcast." So suddenly there's like, a dozen of us in Belfast and we're just hanging out for 4 days, go to karaoke, like go to dinners together, just watch Morbius in a hotel, like buffer in a hotel room, which was a ridiculous experience. And we did all that. And then we had a girl from Austria, from Vienna, who was planning kind of like a Northeast US trip. So starting from DC, going up to Boston eventually with a
Mhm.
friend. And on the way, she stopped by to see a guy who was close to Philly, stopped by to see me in New York, went and did a couple of other things. And because we knew she was coming well in advance, we again got 12 people. We all just got an Airbnb, hung out for a weekend. Well, for me, I had a bunch of them here for about a week. And it was 2 girls from Austria, myself, a couple of people from the UK, couple of people from around the US, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Texas, Kentucky, and a guy from the Netherlands. And suddenly we're
Wow,
just like in this house in Boston. Why are we here? It's wild. It's absolutely wild
that's
that
amazing.
this again, butterfly flaps its wings. Why am I in a house with these
Yeah.
strangers?
Why am I now? That's the start to a horror movie, but a very positive version of it in this
I'm
story.
constantly horrified by the things that they come up with and say. It's on me. That's a me problem. That's my fault for bringing all these people together.
No, I really think that's amazing though, because we talk so much. I don't know if you had this experience
Mhm.
of like online friends with fandom growing up prior to becoming sort of a um
Yeah.
mom of fandom here. Um, but I think there's this fandom, and online fandom in particular has always bred this idea of people who can be like very genuinely close friends online entirely.
Mhm.
And how it can just sort of, like you said, it's you're connecting over one specific thing that's like, this is my nerdy thing. But then the more you talk and the more you interact, the more you realize this is someone who really shares like the values I have, the interests I have,
Yeah.
has things in common, and I care about this person. Um, and I think it's amazing that you've not only built a space where you can experience that, but that you can experience it to such an intense degree that people are like, let me fly to a different country and get into an Airbnb with my internet friends.
Yeah, it's nuts. We're planning Vienna next year. We're gonna go to Austria.
Oh, wow. Wow. Oh, that is that yeah, that's really amazing. I think do you feel sort of like being the person in charge of all of that connection, or the person that, sort of created the space for that connection to exist?
Mm,
How has that weighed on you as a person? Just as a weighed maybe is not the right word, but, sort of affected you as a person?
yeah. Um, I think, as I said earlier, I've always been the kind of person to adopt responsibility or to create things like this and to community manage. I did it when I was, a head cheerleader when I was younger, when I was dance captain in musicals, when I became president of the Filipino Student Association at my university. And this just feels like a continued extent of that thing.
Mm,
Um, at the same time, I think there's like a certain level of separation between the work and the play, right?
mm.
Like, I do feel a very real responsibility and obligation to keep the podcast going, even though there's an entire community that isn't necessarily separate of it, but that has expanded beyond the initial borders of what I expected this to be. And so the great thing I think as a creator is that I can focus on the podcast, and at this point, I trust so many of them that they kind of moderate and manage themselves, which
Mhm.
thankfully isn't like an additional work like burden of work that I have to do, but I don't know, I feel like right now my responsibility as their, like, Hansa mom um, is that I'm just kind of like getting more people into
Yeah.
into the community, and then I'm also bringing them back into the podcast. A lot of people that are most active in the community, a lot of the people that came on vacation are people who have been on the podcast before. So
Okay.
it's very fun. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I love this kind of positive note to end on, so I would love to ask you my final question that I ask everyone, which is if you had never picked up The Witcher,
Mm.
what would be different about you today?
Oh my god, everything. Everything, everything. Since picking up The Witcher, or, my passing interaction with it, you know, met all these people, started the podcast, got to go to all these places, not just on vacation, but also, like, I went to Italy a few years ago for the podcast to cover a Netflix event before the series even came out. On the quest to become a better podcaster, I joined a group of voice actors and then with all the random skills that I had, I was just like, why don't we just create our own show if you guys are struggling to book? So now we're like eyeballs deep in an audio fiction series that will hopefully be coming out next year. But again, it's like butterfly flaps its wings and suddenly like I'm Harriet. And that's like, why am why, like, in what universe would I have like eventually had to play this old geriatric lady with a YouTube channel? None. No universe in which that makes any sense. But there's so many things and people that are part of my life today that just like I wouldn't have experienced otherwise. And I'm so grateful for that like kind of fleeting moment because it's given me such a rich independent experience today.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I think this has been it's always really cool to talk to people who've gone from fan to experiencing fandom to leading a group of fans with your own fandom to some degree. I think fandom and enjoying things in particular and the internet has allowed for such a amazing community and, like, shift in life that you
Mm,
can have these days. And I was talking to someone recently about it and saying, like, if someone had told me you could just be professionally a fan of things growing up, I don't know that I would have gone to college. Like,
Yeah.
I think I was set. I think I had the skills. But I really appreciate you sharing your story and having a conversation with me today. So thank you for
Yeah,
joining me.
absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad I got to, again, just chat more about the things that I'm already talking about.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Alyssa, for joining me again. And to everyone else, thank you for listening. We will be back next week with Travis Reaves, who will be talking about how the NBA got him through a pretty rough time in his life. Between now and then, if you like today's episode, I think you'll also really enjoy an episode we did a few weeks back with Sarah Shackett, focused on Lord of the Rings. We talked a lot about the same themes that we talked about today, of the stickiness of franchises that exist in the fantasy space and finding yourself in that type of franchise. So I think if you like today's episode, you'll really enjoy that one. You can find it just by scrolling back wherever you're listening now and clicking on the episode that reads Lord of the Rings with Sarah Shackett. Between now and next Wednesday, if you want to keep in touch, you can follow me on social media at Marissa Kamari, anywhere you get your social media fix. You can also sign up for my newsletter by going to our website, tandonproductions.com, clicking on You Are What You Love, and signing up there. I send out an issue with every episode of this podcast. And we just started a Discord server, so if you want to connect with me, with other listeners, and talk about the types of things that we are talking about on this show, you can join that by clicking on the link in the episode description. Until next Wednesday, I hope you are enjoying what you love.